Staff Sergeant Michelle Rodriguez crouched behind the crumbling concrete wall, her M4 carbine clutched tight against her chest. The acrid smell of gunpowder and dust filled her nostrils as she listened to the steady rat-tat-tat of enemy fire echoing through the abandoned warehouse district of Kandahar. Her squad of 8 Marines had been pinned down for over an hour, their extraction delayed by a Taliban ambush that had caught them completely off guard. The mission had started simple enough. Intelligence reported a high-value target hiding in a compound 3 clicks north of their forward operating base. Rodriguez had led countless similar operations over her 3 tour in Afghanistan, but something felt different about this one from the moment they'd inserted via helicopter at dawn. The streets were too quiet, the locals too scarce, and the informant who'd provided the tip seemed unusually nervous during the briefing. Now, pressed against the wall with bullets whizzing overhead, Rodriguez's instincts proved correct. This wasn't just a simple grab-and-go mission. They'd walked straight into a carefully orchestrated trap, and her Marines were paying the price for someone else's intelligence failure. Corporal James Thompson lay 20 meters to her left, clutching his shoulder where shrapnel had torn through his Kevlar vest. Private First Class Danny Williams was doing his best to apply pressure to the wound, while returning sporadic fire through a broken window. Rodriguez keyed her radio, trying once again to raise their commanding officer back at base. Blackbird 6, this is Viper 2-1. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation for 1 wounded. Over. Static crackled through her earpiece, followed by the distant voice of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes, their battalion commander who'd been riding her hard ever since she'd questioned his judgment on their last mission. Viper 2-1, Blackbird 6. Air support is 20 minutes out. Hold your position and complete the mission. That's an order, Sergeant. The transmission cut off before Rodriguez could respond, leaving her staring at the radio in disbelief. Complete the mission. With 1 man down and enemy fighters surrounding their position, Hayes was either completely out of touch with reality or had his own agenda that didn't include bringing her squad home alive. She'd butted heads with Hayes before, particularly after she'd filed a formal complaint about his reckless tactics that had gotten 2 good Marines killed in a similar operation 6 weeks earlier. Hayes had made it clear he considered her a troublemaker, someone who questioned authority too much for his liking. But Rodriguez hadn't survived 3 combat tours by following orders blindly, especially from officers who seemed more concerned with their career advancement than the lives of their soldiers. The enemy fire intensified, forcing Rodriguez to duck lower behind the crumbling wall. She could hear her Marines calling out ammunition counts, their voices tight with stress but still professional. These were good soldiers, men who'd followed her into hell because they trusted her judgment. She wasn't about to let Hayes' ego get them killed in some God-forsaken warehouse district. Rodriguez checked her rifle, cycling the bolt to ensure it was ready. 20 minutes felt like an eternity under these conditions, but they'd held worse positions before. She just had to keep her squad alive long enough for help to arrive, assuming Hayes actually intended to send it. The Taliban fighters were getting bolder, their muzzle flashes visible through the smoke and dust as they advanced on the Marines' position. Rodriguez counted at least 12 enemy combatants, possibly more positioned in the surrounding buildings. Her squad was outnumbered and outgunned, but they had training and discipline on their side. More importantly, they had each other. "Williams, how's Thompson?" Rodriguez called out, raising her voice over the gunfire. "Stable, Sergeant. Bleeding's under control, but he needs a medic soon," Williams replied, his young face streaked with dirt and concern. Rodriguez nodded, making a mental note to get Thompson evacuated as soon as possible. The kid was tough, but shrapnel wounds could turn serious quickly in this heat and dust. She'd already lost too many good Marines to preventable casualties caused by delayed evacuations. A grenade explosion echoed from somewhere behind enemy lines, followed by excited shouting in Pashto. Rodriguez frowned, trying to decipher what they were saying. Her language skills were limited, but she'd picked up enough during her tour to understand basic tactical communications. It sounded like they were preparing for a final assault, trying to overrun the Marines' position before air support could arrive. She keyed her radio again. "Blackbird 6, Viper 2-1. Enemy is massing for assault. We need that air support now, over." The response came back cold and mechanical, Hayes' voice betraying no emotion despite the urgency of the situation. "Viper 2-1, maintain position. Air support is 15 minutes out. Use your training, Sergeant." The dismissive tone in Hayes' voice made Rodriguez's jaw clench. Use your training. She'd been using her training for the past hour while Hayes sat safely in his air-conditioned command center, probably more worried about his briefing slides than the lives of his Marines. Rodriguez had enlisted 12 years ago, straight out of high school in El Paso, Texas. She'd risen through the ranks the hard way, earning respect through competence and courage rather than political connections. Unlike Hayes, who'd fast-tracked through officer candidate school and had never seen real combat until his current deployment, Rodriguez had bled for every stripe on her sleeve. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd probably forgotten more about combat tactics than Hayes had ever learned. Yet he was the one making life-and-death decisions from behind a desk. Military hierarchy had its place, but not when it put good soldiers at unnecessary risk. Rodriguez had sworn an oath to protect her Marines, and she intended to honor that oath regardless of what Hayes thought about her methods. Another burst of enemy fire forced Rodriguez to reassess their tactical situation. The Taliban fighters were using classic insurgent tactics, firing from multiple positions to confuse and disorient their targets. But Rodriguez had faced similar situations before, and she knew that patience and accurate fire would eventually turn the tide. The key was keeping her Marines calm and focused until air support arrived. Private Martinez, positioned at the far end of their defensive line, suddenly called out a warning. "Sergeant, I've got movement on the north side. Looks like they're trying to flank us." Rodriguez cursed under her breath. If the enemy succeeded in flanking their position, her squad would be caught in a crossfire with no way to retreat. She needed to act fast before the situation became completely untenable. Rodriguez signaled to Corporal Peterson, her second in command, to shift 2 Marines to cover the northern approach. Peterson nodded and began moving, keeping low to avoid enemy fire. The man was solid, a veteran of 2 previous deployments who'd proven himself reliable under pressure. Rodriguez trusted him to execute her orders without question, something she couldn't say about their commanding officer back at base. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed in the distance, but Rodriguez knew it would be several more minutes before they arrived. In combat, minutes felt like hours, and a lot could happen in that time. She'd seen entire squads wiped out in seconds by a single well-placed explosive or accurate sniper fire. The key was staying alert and ready to adapt to changing circumstances. Rodriguez checked her ammunition count, noting that she was down to her last 2 magazines. The sustained firefight had burned through their supplies faster than expected, and she'd need to make every shot count from here on out. She made a mental note to discuss ammunition loads with her squad after this mission, assuming they all made it home alive. The Taliban fighters seemed to sense the approaching helicopters as well, their fire becoming more desperate and erratic. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different buildings, suggesting a coordinated attack designed to inflict maximum casualties before air support arrived. It was a classic insurgent tactic, one she'd encountered numerous times during her previous deployments. What bothered Rodriguez most about the situation wasn't the enemy fire, or even the tactical disadvantage her squad faced. It was the knowledge that Hayes could have prevented this entire mess with better intelligence gathering and more careful mission planning. Instead, he'd rushed them into a trap based on questionable information from an unreliable source. Rodriguez had tried to voice her concerns during the mission briefing, but Hayes had dismissed her input as unnecessary negativity. He'd made it clear that he wanted subordinates who followed orders without question, not experienced NCOs who might challenge his authority. The result was 8 Marines trapped in a firefight that could have been avoided with proper reconnaissance and planning. The irony was that Rodriguez actually respected the chain of command when it functioned properly. She'd served under numerous officers during her career, and most had been competent professionals who valued input from their senior enlisted personnel. Hayes was different, though. He seemed to view any questioning of his judgment as a personal attack on his authority. Rodriguez's radio crackled again, this time with the voice of the helicopter pilot. Viper 2-1, this is Pegasus 7. We're 2 minutes out from your position. Mark your location with smoke, over. Finally, Rodriguez thought help was almost here. She reached for a smoke grenade on her belt, pulling the pin and tossing it into the open area in front of their position. Purple smoke began billowing up, clearly marking their location for the incoming aircraft. The Taliban fighters must have realized what the smoke meant, because their fire suddenly intensified. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming rockets, followed by explosions that shook the ground beneath her feet. They were making a final, desperate push to overrun the Marines' position before air support could intervene. Rodriguez raised her M4 and began returning fire, her shots precise and measured despite the chaos around her. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd spent years perfecting. In moments like these, all the politics and personality conflicts melted away, leaving only the fundamental truth of combat: kill or be killed. The sound of rotor blades grew louder, and Rodriguez could see the dark silhouette of an Apache helicopter approaching from the south. Relief flooded through her as she watched the aircraft's nose turn toward the enemy positions. In a few seconds, those Taliban fighters would discover what American firepower could do when properly applied. But then something went wrong. Rodriguez's rifle jammed just as she was lining up a shot on an enemy fighter who was advancing on Peterson's position. She pulled the trigger and heard the distinctive click of a misfire, followed by the mechanical grinding of a bolt that refused to cycle properly. In 12 years of service, she'd never experienced a malfunction at such a critical moment. Rodriguez immediately began the standard malfunction drill, trying to clear the jam while keeping her head down to avoid enemy fire. But the bolt was stuck solid, and she could see the enemy fighter getting closer to Peterson's position. The man was carrying what looked like an RPG launcher, and if he got close enough to use it, Peterson and at least 2 other Marines would be dead. Time slowed to a crawl as Rodriguez watched the enemy fighter raise his weapon. She could see Peterson turning toward the threat, his own rifle coming up to engage, but Rodriguez knew he wouldn't be fast enough. The physics of the situation were simple and deadly. The RPG would reach Peterson's position before Peterson could acquire and engage the target. Rodriguez's mind raced through possible solutions. She could try to tackle the enemy fighter, but the distance was too great and she'd be cut down by his allies before she could close the gap. She could try to throw her rifle at him, but that would only delay the inevitable by a few seconds. There had to be something else, some option she wasn't seeing. That's when she noticed the grenade lying in the rubble about 10 feet from her position. It was an enemy grenade, probably dropped by one of the Taliban fighters during the earlier exchange of fire. The pin was still in place, making it safe to handle, but Rodriguez realized it could also be turned into a weapon against its former owners. Without hesitation, Rodriguez abandoned her jammed rifle and lunged for the grenade. Her fingers closed around the metal sphere just as the enemy fighter with the RPG launcher prepared to fire. Rodriguez pulled the pin, counted to 3, and hurled the grenade with all her strength toward the advancing enemy positions. The throw was perfect, landing directly in the middle of the Taliban fighters' formation. The explosion sent shrapnel flying in all directions, taking out not only the man with the RPG, but also 2 other fighters who had been providing covering fire. The remaining enemy combatants scattered, their coordinated attack broken by the unexpected counterattack. Rodriguez watched in satisfaction as the Apache helicopter opened fire on the fleeing Taliban fighters. The aircraft's 30 cannon tore through the concrete walls like paper, eliminating the remaining threats with surgical precision. Within minutes, the firefight was over, and the warehouse district fell silent except for the sound of rotor blades and her Marine's heavy breathing. Viper 2-1, this is Pegasus 7. Area secure. We're sending in the medevac bird for your wounded, the helicopter pilot radioed. Rodriguez keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Pegasus 7, Viper 2-1, roger that. We have 1 urgent surgical and 7 walking wounded. LZ is clear for landing. She looked around at her squad, taking inventory of their condition. They were all alive, though several had minor injuries from flying debris and shrapnel. Most importantly, they were all going home. Rodriguez retrieved her jammed rifle and began the process of field stripping it to identify the malfunction. The bolt was seized due to excessive carbon buildup, a maintenance issue that should have been caught during pre-mission inspections. She made a mental note to discuss weapon maintenance protocols with her squad, though she knew the real problem was the high operational tempo that gave them little time for proper equipment care. The medevac helicopter landed in a cloud of dust and debris, its crew chief jumping out to assist with loading Thompson onto a stretcher. Rodriguez helped carry her wounded Marine to the aircraft, staying with him until the medics had him stabilized for transport. Thompson was conscious and alert, a good sign that his injuries weren't life-threatening. "Tell my wife I'm okay, Sergeant," Thompson said, his voice strained but determined. Rodriguez squeezed his shoulder, nodding the trust in his eyes despite the pain he was feeling. "You tell her yourself when you get to the hospital, Marine." "That's an order," Rodriguez replied, managing a smile despite the stress of the past 2 hours. Thompson nodded and closed his eyes as the medics administered pain medication, preparing him for the flight to the combat hospital. Rodriguez watched the medevac helicopter disappear into the afternoon sky, carrying Thompson to safety and medical care. She'd done her job, kept her Marines alive despite being outnumbered and outgunned. But she knew this wouldn't be the end of her problems with Hayes. If anything, her success would probably irritate him further, especially since she'd accomplished the mission despite his inadequate support. The extraction helicopter arrived 30 minutes later, its crew chief gesturing for Rodriguez and her remaining Marines to board quickly. As they lifted off from the warehouse district, Rodriguez could see the damage their firefight had caused. Several buildings were riddled with bullet holes, and smoke still rose from the positions where the Apache had engaged the Taliban fighters. Rodriguez settled back in her seat, finally allowing herself to relax for the first time in hours. Her Marines were safe, the mission was complete, and they were heading home to their forward operating base. But she knew that the real battle was just beginning. Hayes would want a full after-action report, and Rodriguez intended to be completely honest about the intelligence failure that had led to the ambush. The helicopter banked toward their base, and Rodriguez could see the familiar brown landscape of Afghanistan stretching out below them. She'd spent over 2 years of her life in this country, fighting a war that seemed to have no clear endpoint. But moments like today reminded her why she'd chosen to serve: to protect the Marines under her command and ensure they all made it home to their families. Rodriguez's mind drifted to her own family back in Texas. Her mother still worried about her every day, despite Rodriguez's assurances that she was well-trained and careful. Her younger brother had followed her into the military, joining the army and currently serving in Germany. They'd always been close, bonded by their shared experience of growing up in a military family. The helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone, and Rodriguez could see Hayes waiting on the tarmac with several other officers. His expression was unreadable from this distance, but Rodriguez knew he wouldn't be pleased with her after-action report. She'd have to be careful how she presented her findings, focusing on facts rather than personal opinions about his leadership. As the helicopter touched down, Rodriguez gathered her gear and prepared to debrief with her squad. They'd need to account for all equipment and ammunition, document any maintenance issues with their weapons, and prepare written statements about the engagement. It was the least glamorous part of combat operations, but Rodriguez knew that accurate reporting was essential for learning from their experiences. Rodriguez stepped off the helicopter and immediately noticed Hayes approaching with a stern expression. She'd seen that look before, usually when he was preparing to deliver a lecture about proper military deportment or the importance of following orders without question. Rodriguez straightened her shoulders and prepared for whatever criticism he had prepared. "Sergeant Rodriguez, we need to talk," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of command but also a hint of something else. Rodriguez couldn't tell if he was angry about the mission outcome or pleased that they'd succeeded despite the challenging circumstances. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez replied, following Hayes toward the command bunker where debriefings were typically conducted. She could feel the eyes of other Marines watching as they walked, wondering what had happened during the mission and whether their sergeant was in trouble with the commanding officer. The command bunker was a reinforced concrete structure that served as the nerve center for their forward operating base. Inside, Rodriguez could see the banks of computers and communication equipment that Hayes used to coordinate operations throughout their area of responsibility. It was impressive technology, but Rodriguez knew that all the computers in the world couldn't replace good judgment and combat experience. Hayes gestured for Rodriguez to take a seat at the briefing table, then closed the door behind them. The sudden silence was almost deafening after hours of gunfire and helicopter noise, and Rodriguez found herself instinctively listening for sounds of incoming mortars or rocket attacks. Living in a combat zone created habits that were hard to break. "I've read the preliminary reports from the helicopter crews," Hayes began, his tone formal and professional. "It appears your squad encountered significant resistance during what should have been a routine operation. I want to hear your version of events, starting from the moment you inserted this morning." Rodriguez took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts before beginning her report. She knew that Hayes was looking for any excuse to criticize her performance, but she also knew that her Marines' lives might depend on her being completely honest about the intelligence failure that had led to the ambush. "Sir, from the moment we inserted, the situation felt wrong," Rodriguez began, her voice calm and professional despite the tension in the room. "The streets were too quiet, the locals had cleared out, and our informant seemed nervous during the briefing. I should have recommended aborting the mission, but I followed orders and led my squad to the target building." Hayes' expression didn't change, but Rodriguez could see him making notes on his tablet. She continued her report, detailing the ambush, the firefight, and the eventual resolution through air support. She made sure to emphasize the professionalism of her Marines and their adherence to rules of engagement despite the challenging circumstances. "And then your rifle jammed at a critical moment," Hayes said, referring to his notes. "How do you explain that malfunction, Sergeant?" Rodriguez had been expecting this question, and she'd prepared a careful response. "Sir, preliminary examination suggests carbon buildup in the bolt assembly, likely caused by the high operational tempo and limited time for proper maintenance. I take full responsibility for the equipment failure." Hayes nodded, making another note. Rodriguez could tell he was building a case for something, but she wasn't sure what. Her rifle malfunction was unfortunate, but it hadn't prevented the mission from succeeding. If anything, her quick thinking with the enemy grenade had saved lives and demonstrated the kind of initiative that should be rewarded, not punished. "Tell me about the grenade, Sergeant," Hayes said, his tone becoming more pointed. "You abandoned your primary weapon to throw an enemy explosive device at opposing forces. That's not standard procedure." Rodriguez felt a flash of anger but kept her voice level. "Sir, with respect, there is no standard procedure for the situation I faced. My rifle was jammed. My Marines were under fire, and I had seconds to act. I used the resources available to neutralize the threat and protect my squad." Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Rodriguez with an expression she couldn't read. The resources available included calling for immediate air support, which you failed to do until much later in the engagement. "Sir, I called for air support multiple times during the firefight," Rodriguez replied, her patience beginning to wear thin. "I was told to hold position and wait 20 minutes for aircraft that were already airborne. If I had waited for permission to use that grenade, Corporal Peterson and 2 other Marines would be dead." The room fell silent, and Rodriguez could see Hayes processing her words. She'd been careful not to directly criticize his handling of the situation, but the implication was clear. His delayed response had put Marines at unnecessary risk. Rodriguez knew she was walking a fine line between honesty and insubordination. Hayes stood up and began packing behind his desk, a habit Rodriguez had noticed during previous briefings. "Sergeant, I'm concerned about your tendency to freelance during combat operations. This is the second time in 6 weeks that you've deviated from established procedures to pursue your own tactical solutions." Rodriguez felt her jaw clench. Hayes was referring to the previous mission where she disobeyed his order to advance across open ground, instead finding an alternative route that had avoided casualties. Her decision had been tactically sound, but Hayes had viewed it as a challenge to his authority. "Sir, my primary responsibility is to the Marines under my command," Rodriguez said carefully. "I will always prioritize their safety over strict adherence to procedures that may not account for changing tactical situations." Hayes stopped packing and turned to face Rodriguez directly. "Your primary responsibility is to follow orders, Sergeant. The military operates on a chain of command for a reason. When subordinates start making their own decisions in combat, people die." Rodriguez bit back her initial response, knowing that arguing with Hayes would only make the situation worse. But she couldn't help thinking about the Marines who had died 6 weeks ago, because Hayes had insisted on following his original plan despite clear evidence that it was flawed. "Sir, I understand the importance of following orders," Rodriguez replied diplomatically. But I also believe that combat leaders have a responsibility to adapt to changing circumstances and protect their subordinates. That's what I was trained to do, and that's what I'll continue to do. Hayes returned to his seat, his expression suggesting that he'd made up his mind about something. Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm recommending you for a transfer to a non-combat position. Your skills would be better utilized in a training environment where your tendency to question authority won't put Marines at risk. Rodriguez felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. A transfer to a non-combat position would effectively end her career as an infantry Marine, relegating her to a desk job for the remainder of her enlistment. It would also separate her from the Marines she'd trained and fought alongside for the past 2 years. Sir, with respect, I believe my Marines would disagree with your assessment, Rodriguez said, struggling to keep her voice steady. They trust me to keep them alive, and today's mission proves that my judgment under fire is sound. Hayes' expression hardened. Today's mission proves that you're a liability, Sergeant. Your rifle malfunction put your entire squad at risk, and your decision to use an enemy grenade could have resulted in friendly fire casualties. I won't have loose cannons in my command. Rodriguez realized that Hayes had already made up his mind before she'd entered the room. The debriefing was just a formality, a way to build a paper trail justifying his decision to remove her from combat operations. She'd been outmaneuvered by an officer who cared more about his authority than the lives of his Marines. Sir, I request permission to speak with the battalion commander about this matter, Rodriguez said, invoking her right to appeal Hayes' decision through the chain of command. Hayes smiled coldly. Permission denied, Sergeant. Colonel Peterson is aware of my concerns about your performance and supports my recommendation. You'll be transferred to Camp Pendleton within the week to assume duties as a marksmanship instructor. Rodriguez felt her world collapsing around her. Camp Pendleton was a stateside training base where she'd spend her days teaching basic rifle skills to recruits. It was important work, but it wasn't combat, and it wasn't where she belonged. Her Marines would be left under the command of an officer who prioritized his ego over their safety. Sir, what about my squad? Rodriguez asked, knowing she was probably pushing Hayes too far but unable to stop herself. They've been together for 18 months. Breaking up that team will hurt morale and effectiveness. Hayes stood up, signaling that the debriefing was over. That's no longer your concern, Sergeant. Corporal Peterson will assume squad leader duties until a replacement sergeant arrives. Your Marines will adapt, just like they always do. Rodriguez saluted mechanically and turned to leave, her mind racing through possible options. She could try to go over Hayes' head to the regimental commander, but that would require evidence of misconduct that she didn't have. Hayes had been careful to couch his criticism in terms of tactical disagreement rather than personal vendetta. As she walked back to her barracks, Rodriguez could see her Marines waiting for her return. They'd cleaned and secured their weapons, prepared their after-action reports, and were ready for her guidance on lessons learned from the day's engagement. She dreaded having to tell them that this would be their last mission together. Corporal Peterson approached first, his expression concerned. "Sergeant, how did the debrief go? Are we in trouble for the equipment malfunction?" Rodriguez looked at Peterson, seeing the trust and respect in his eyes. These men had followed her into combat because they believed in her judgment and leadership. How could she explain that their commanding officer viewed those same qualities as threats to his authority? "We need to talk, Marines," Rodriguez said, gesturing for her squad to gather around. "There are going to be some changes in our unit structure, and I want you to hear it from me first." Rodriguez spent the next hour explaining the situation to her Marines, watching their expressions change from confusion to anger to resignation. These were professional soldiers who understood the realities of military life, but Rodriguez could see the disappointment in their faces. They'd been a team, and now that team was being broken up for political reasons. "Sergeant, this is bullshit," Private Williams said, his young face flushed with anger. "You saved our lives today and now they're punishing you for it. Where's the justice in that?" Rodriguez appreciated Williams' loyalty, but she also knew that his outburst could get him in trouble if it reached Hayes' ears. "Marine, I understand your frustration, but we're all professionals here. We follow orders and adapt to changing circumstances. That's what makes us Marines." Peterson stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Sergeant, what do you need us to do? If there's any way we can help fight this transfer, just say the word." Rodriguez was touched by Peterson's offer, but she knew that her Marines getting involved would only make the situation worse. Hayes would view any support for her as further evidence of her corrupting influence on the unit. She had to protect them from the fallout of her conflict with their commanding officer. "I need you to take care of each other," Rodriguez said simply. "Peterson, you're going to be leading this squad soon, and these Marines are going to need your guidance. Learn from today's mission, stay alert, and bring everyone home alive. That's all I've ever asked of any of you." Rodriguez spent her last few days at the forward operating base, writing detailed reports about her squad's training status, equipment needs, and individual performance evaluations. She wanted to ensure that Peterson had all the information he needed to lead effectively, even if Hayes chose to ignore her recommendations. The hardest part was watching her Marines try to adjust to the news of her transfer. They remained professional during duty hours, but Rodriguez could see the impact on their morale. They'd lost confidence in their chain of command, and that could be dangerous in combat situations where trust was essential for survival. On her final night at the base, Rodriguez's Marines organized an unofficial farewell gathering in the recreation tent. They shared stories about their deployments, talked about their families back home, and tried to maintain the bonds that had kept them alive through 18 months of combat operations. Sergeant, you taught us that taking care of your Marines is more important than following stupid orders, Corporal Peterson said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. We won't forget that lesson, no matter who's giving the orders. Rodriguez felt tears threatening but managed to keep her composure. These men had been her responsibility, her family, and her reason for getting up every morning in this hostile environment. Leaving them felt like abandoning her duty, even though she had no choice in the matter. The transport helicopter arrived at dawn, and Rodriguez gathered her gear for the journey to Kandahar airfield. From there, she'd catch a military transport to Germany, then another flight to California and her new assignment at Camp Pendleton. It was a journey that would take her thousands of miles from the war zone, but she knew that part of her would always remain with her Marines. As the helicopter lifted off, Rodriguez looked down at her squad assembled on the landing zone. They stood at attention, saluting their departing sergeant with the respect and affection that had defined their relationship. Rodriguez returned the salute, knowing that this moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. The flight to Kandahar gave Rodriguez time to process everything that had happened. She joined the Marines to serve her country and protect her fellow Americans, but she discovered that sometimes the greatest threats came from within the military itself. Officers like Hayes, who prioritized their careers over their subordinates' lives, were more dangerous than any enemy combatant. At Kandahar airfield, Rodriguez checked in for her flight to Germany, beginning the long journey back to the United States. She'd spent over 2 years in Afghanistan, earning the respect of her Marines and the enmity of her commanding officer. Now she was returning home with a sense of unfinished business and a determination to ensure that her experience wouldn't be wasted. The commercial flight from Germany to Los Angeles was filled with service members rotating back to the United States, some returning from deployments, others heading to new assignments. Rodriguez sat quietly, thinking about her future and how she could continue to serve her Marines, even from a distance. Camp Pendleton was a sprawling Marine base north of San Diego, home to thousands of Marines and their families. Rodriguez had been stationed there briefly early in her career, but returning felt different now. She was older, more experienced, and carrying the weight of command decisions that had kept her Marines alive in combat. Rodriguez's new assignment was with the School of Infantry, where she would train new Marines in marksmanship and basic combat skills. It was important work, but it felt like a step backward after leading combat operations in Afghanistan. She knew that Hayes had intended the transfer as a punishment, but Rodriguez was determined to make the best of her situation. The marksmanship training facility was a modern complex with multiple firing ranges and classrooms for instruction. Rodriguez was impressed by the quality of the equipment and the professionalism of the staff, but she couldn't help thinking about her Marines still fighting in Afghanistan under Peterson's leadership. Rodriguez's first week at Camp Pendleton was spent learning the training curriculum and meeting her new colleagues. The other instructors were experienced Marines who'd served in various combat zones, and they welcomed Rodriguez with the professional courtesy that defined the Corps. But Rodriguez could tell that some of them knew about her transfer and the circumstances surrounding it. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen was Rodriguez's immediate supervisor, a career Marine who'd served multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was professional but distant during their initial meetings, and Rodriguez sensed that he was evaluating her performance carefully. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I've read your service record," Chen said during their first private meeting. "You've got impressive combat experience and strong leadership evaluations. I'm curious why you requested a transfer to a training position." Rodriguez had been expecting this question, and she'd prepared a careful response. "Staff Sergeant, I felt that my experience could be better utilized training the next generation of Marines. There's a lot of value in passing on lessons learned from combat operations." Chen nodded, but Rodriguez could see skepticism in his eyes. "That's admirable, Sergeant, but I have to ask, are you planning to stay in the Corps after this assignment, or are you just marking time until your enlistment expires?" It was a fair question, and Rodriguez appreciated Chen's directness. "Staff Sergeant, I'm committed to serving wherever the Corps needs me. My goal is to train these Marines to the best of my ability and ensure they're prepared for whatever challenges they face." Chen seemed satisfied with her response, but Rodriguez knew she'd have to prove herself through her performance rather than her words. The Marine Corps valued results over rhetoric, and Rodriguez intended to demonstrate her worth through the quality of her training programs. Rodriguez's first class was a group of 24 Marines fresh from boot camp, eager to learn the advanced skills they'd need for their military occupational specialties. Looking at their young faces, Rodriguez was reminded of her own early days in the Corps, when everything seemed possible and the future was full of potential. "Marines, my name is Sergeant Rodriguez, and I'm going to teach you how to shoot accurately under stress," Rodriguez began, her voice carrying the authority of combat experience. "The skills you learn here might save your life or the life of the Marine next to you. That's why we're going to take this training seriously." Rodriguez spent the next several hours conducting marksmanship instruction, sharing techniques she'd learned through years of combat experience. She could see the Marines responding to her teaching, their accuracy improving as they absorbed her lessons. It was satisfying work, but Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that she belonged in Afghanistan with her old squad. During her lunch break, Rodriguez checked her personal email and found a message from Corporal Peterson. Her heart raced as she opened it, hopping for news about her Marines' welfare and current operations. Sergeant Rodriguez wanted to let you know that everyone is doing well. Thompson is back from the hospital and cleared for duty. We had a successful mission last week, and I used the tactics you taught us about room clearing. The new squad leader is okay, but he's not you. We miss having you with us. Stay safe and know that your Marines are thinking about you. Rodriguez felt tears welling up as she read Peterson's message. Her Marines were continuing to serve with distinction, but she could tell from Peterson's words that her absence was affecting unit morale. She quickly typed a response, encouraging Peterson to continue developing his leadership skills and reminding him to take care of their Marines. Over the following weeks, Rodriguez threw herself into her training duties, developing new curriculum based on her combat experience. She created realistic scenarios that would prepare Marines for the challenges they'd face in Afghanistan and Iraq, emphasizing the importance of teamwork and communication under stress. Rodriguez's reputation as an instructor grew quickly, and she began receiving requests from other units to conduct specialized training. Word spread that she was a combat veteran who could teach Marines practical skills they'd actually use in combat, not just abstract principles from outdated manuals. But Rodriguez's success at Camp Pendleton didn't ease the frust.